welcome you all to this month's Tripod Care Emotional Wellbeing Hub. February 2021, Dr. T. Ayodele Ajayi founded Tripod Care, an online emotional well-being hub born out of the need that emerged during the COVID-19 lockdown. Motivated by real-life experiences in our communities, a recognition of a safe space where mental health could be discussed in a needs-led fashion emerged. After over 20 years of public mental health education to Black church communities, Tripod Care was launched to address the unique challenges that the intersection of faith, culture, and mental health presents. Through our events, book clubs, liaisons with churches and leaders, and our WhatsApp groups, we work in bridging the gap between cultural sensitivity, spiritual care, and mental health. Since its inception, Tripod Care has hosted over 50 online workshops, created safe spaces for open conversations on mental health, and partnered with churches to provide training and support. Through Tripod Care workshops, mentorships, consultancy, and a YouTube channel, Dr. Ajayi, who is a consultant psychiatrist and a fellow of UK Royal College of Psychiatrists, along with his team, continues to champion one vision, a community where mental health and spiritual well-being go hand in hand. He provides safe spaces for candid conversations, offer one-to-one support, and signposting and training to churches and leaders. By making mental health education accessible and relevant and relatable, we aim to build communities that prioritize mental health, are resilient, and are whole in spirit, soul, and body. Please join us as we enjoy today's Tripod Care.
So welcome everyone again to tonight's Tripod Care Emotional Wellbeing Hub. And I'm going to be your main host, Dr. T. Ayodele Ajayi. And I'm going to share my screen now, and we are going to get the show rolling. Right. Okay, could I just confirm again that everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
Brilliant, good. Okay, so that's that. So tonight we've got quite a bit to get through, but the theme is really about what can we do as communities to support the global suicide prevention drive and initiative. Because the reality is that a lot of times people think that when I speak to people who are outside the mental health community, the information I get, the feedback I get is that people think that mental health, suicide prevention is the role, an exclusive role of people who work in mental health. But as we go on tonight, we'll find out that that's not really the case, that every one of us who is on this platform tonight can actually be a part of the suicide prevention plan globally. There is a role we can play. I know we've talked about the Tripod Care model already. And just to say that, please feel free to keep your cameras on or off. Whatever suits you is fine, but please stay muted if you're not making a contribution or asking a question. I'm also aware that suicide can be quite it can generate quite a lot of emotions. And so if there's anyone who feels triggered or who feels disturbed by anything that I will be discussing or that will be taking place, even as we have our dialogue tonight, I encourage you to please reach out. Please send either myself a message or send Bikumi or any of the other team members who are on the call a message. So what we don't want is for anyone to be distressed and to go away like that without getting support. At the end of the about 60, 75 minutes presentation, I will then be taking questions and answers. And just to also say that we've got a Tripod Care Emotional Wellbeing Hub YouTube channel. one of my co-hosts will be posting the channel on the chat, so that all the videos that are recorded from these meetings are usually edited and then uploaded. We will usually edit out anything that is confidential, and those are uploaded onto the YouTube channel so that they can be accessible and they can be available in public domain. So if you are interested in accessing the previous events we've hosted, or you'll be interested in being informed when the next ones are uploaded, please just consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, and then you'll be notified every time there's a new upload. Also, as part of the support groups, we do have a number of other support groups. We've got a number of tripart WhatsApp groups. We've got one specifically for leaders, people who lead either in the community, who lead in churches, who lead in faith groups, who lead generally in the community, or who lead charities or organizations. There's a group for them, but also we also have a group for a generic group, and then we also have a book club. Towards the end of the meeting, I'll be sharing the details of the future events that we're going to have. So it's always very important to explain that, to share that this event is a public mental health education event. It's not a personal consultation by any means. As the person who is the main facilitator for today, I've done my due diligence to make sure that all the information provided is accurate and that it's up to date. However, when it comes to making a personal decision about your mental health, if you do, please do consult with your personal mental care provider. That could be your psychiatrist, your psychiatric nurse, your mental practitioner, psychologist, counselor, whoever it is that takes a lead on your care. It's very important to do that before making any decisions regarding mental health. However, just to also say that all of this is being recorded. If you do not want to feature in the recording, please, by all means, just please use a pseudonym and feel free to switch off your camera. That's just my profile for some of us who may not know, who may not have been to any of these events before. That's my profile. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and also an expert witness in the UK. And I do hold a number of other roles. I'm in the pastoral board of the church that I attend. I'm also involved in public mental health education, and I've been blessed with some of my work being featured in the BBC Office of Health Improvement and Health Disparity. And one of the joys of my life is public speaking. And it's also a joy to be able to serve in different roles, working on boards of charities and chairing a few of them. And Tripart Care, as you know, this is Tripart Care. And I also do spearhead an initiative that supports young people from ethnic minority backgrounds to get into medical school. And one of the other joys of my life is writing. So I write quite a lot of mental health publications. Yeah. Okay. Right. So now let's start with the basics. I know it's a Thursday evening, and there are Thursday evening here in the UK. In some places, I can see there are some Americans on the call. It's a Thursday afternoon. So I know this is very valuable time and I appreciate you spending that time with us at Tripart Care. So it's really important that you get the best out of today. And that's something we take very seriously. So what can you do? What can we do as people who are attending today? I would encourage everyone to try to take notes. That's archiving, recording things down. We know that when we record things down, we are less likely to forget them. And it's almost like we are giving that knowledge some legacy. We are giving it a lifespan. It's no longer in the ether. It means it's now recorded. It's been nailed to paper. So please record things that strike you today. I also encourage you to take action as soon as possible. There's what is called the law of diminishing return, the law of diminishing intent. The law of diminishing intent states that the longer you wait to take action on what you know you need to do, the less likely you are ever going to do it. So the point I'm trying to make with all that long speech is this, that please try and take actions as soon as possible. It might be just ringing up a friend you haven't heard from in a long while. It might be checking up on somebody that you feel has been struggling. It might be asking a work colleague about how they are doing because you've noticed that they've not really been looking themselves. It's just, but please take action as soon as possible. And also, accountability is a very good thing. There's science research showing that when we're accountable, when we hold ourselves accountable to somebody to say, check in on me, this is the decision I've made. Please check in on me and be my accountability partner. Hold me responsible to this. We are more likely, and that's research, we are more likely to achieve those. If you have a gym body, you are more likely to be consistent with your gym attendance. If you join a diet group, for instance, Weight Watchers, you are more likely to lose weight than somebody who's doing it solo. So that's just about accountability. Think about who can support you, who can help you to come along in your journey today. And of course, there's also the assessment in terms of measuring progress. Measuring progress is really about setting yourself a plan. When am I going to check in on myself and see how I'm progressing with what I've committed to? Right. So today we are going to look at the maths, the myths of because one of the challenges of suicide is that there are a lot of things that we believed or we think to be true that are not. So we are going to address those myths today. We are going to look at what the statistics of suicide actually says and what works. The good news is that despite how bleak suicide sounds, there's actually research evidence. There are things that we can do as communities. There are things that we can do to actually bring down suicide rates there. So it's not a lost battle. It's actually, there are things that are proven to work and we can learn them, which is really good news. And those things are not necessarily things that are delivered by mental services. Sometimes it's things that happen in community. For instance, one of the things that we know that works in terms of preventing suicide is public mental health education about suicide. When people are more aware of suicide, they know what to look out for. Members of the community, we know that that's likely that's something that we know has been effective in helping with suicide. So it's those type of things that we are talking about tonight. And then we are going to look at male suicide. The reason why we are looking at male suicide is this, that we found out that in most countries of the world, globally, the rate of suicide among men is twice as common as women. That's globally. However, when we look at individual countries, for instance, in the UK, we know when you look at the population of people who die by suicide, 75% of them are usually males, whereas 25% are females. So it makes sense to look at what male suicide looks like and how to prevent it whilst we think, because by looking at male suicide, we're actually looking at the larger population of people who die by suicide. And then how do you start a conversation or support people who are suicidal? What are the things that corporate organizations, churches, charities, faith organizations can do to actually help people who are suicidal or to put systems in place? Because when people are distressed, they tend to go to churches, to places of worship. What can those organizations do to actually support people who are suicidal? How can they sensitize their population to be able to be well equipped to actually do that, to perform that, to carry out that role and responsibility? Because it's a responsibility. And then often I get asked about suicide prevention in low and middle income countries, because the reality is that most suicides, about more than 50% of suicides, actually 75% of suicides, take place in low and medium income countries. And then we're going to then look at suicide prevention resources, and we're going to do take questions and answers. So, Professor Sir Louis Appleby, I call him the Sir of, so he's Sir because he's been knighted by the Queen. However, I also call him the Sir of suicide prevention in the UK. And he's a leading global name in suicide prevention. And this is what he said. He said, suicide prevention starts with society's values. That's why we're hosting this event, because this is not a an event that is being hosted in an academic community. It's being hosted in the community for a reason. And that's because society, community play a role in suicide prevention. So it says that it starts when society's values change, when we begin to break down the shame that deter men from seeking help, and we offer young people opportunity and hope. I couldn't agree more. In all the 25 years that I've been seeing people who are suicidal in the clinic settings, in emergency rooms, and various places, and sometimes also supporting people in community outside of work, I couldn't agree more with Sir Louis Appleby that indeed that's the way to go. And when it comes to suicide, I'm sure that every one of us know what suicide is. Suicide is said to occur when there is an intentional death that has taken place, when somebody orchestrates their own death intentionally, not that they've decided that they do not want to live again, and they then make that happen. So let's look at the myths first. Before we start looking at the facts, let's start very quickly to begin to address the things that are not true. One of the things that are helpful is that, people throw up their hands and say, oh, yeah, we can't prevent suicide. Anybody is going to take their lives will take their lives anyway. That's not actually accurate, and it's not true. Because it's more or less a hopeless and a defeatist or withdrawn approach to suicide prevention. The evidence actually shows that it's possible by certain means that we can. There are research proven evidences that show that we can actually prevent suicide, and that includes some of the things that we're doing now by educating ourselves and getting to know what the risk factors are, getting to know to support those who are in distress and to spot those who are in distress and to support them to get help. So if there's anything to take away from today, if you probably belong to that group of people who have previously felt that, oh yeah, we can't do anything about suicide anyway, we can't prevent it, that's inaccurate. The other one is that suicide prevention is exclusively for mental health professionals. That's something I also hear often, that, oh, I'm not a psychiatric nurse. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a social worker, a mental social worker, so I have no role. Everyone has a role. Suicide prevention is everyone's business. And if we can take away that as well with us, that every one of us has a role, every one of us can learn to support the suicidal people, because the reality is that most suicides, the greater percentage of suicide actually take place in the community rather than in mental health institutions. Most of the suicide take place in communities. And when they take place, they are usually the nearest contacts are usually members of the community rather than members of the mental service, people who are involved in mental services. And the other one that people worry about is, but if I ask them, am I going to put a seed in their minds? Maybe somebody who wasn't previously suicidal, maybe if I ask him, then he's going to get suicidal. The evidence also shows that by asking people, we don't sow a seed in their minds. Actually, asking is better than not asking, because we do know that when we don't ask, we could miss an opportunity. And in fact, the evidence also shows that people who are suicidal, people who have been suicidal and who have recovered from suicidal distress, actually say that they were longing and hoping that somebody would ask them. Sometimes in communities and in society, we are too reserved for the good of community. We are too polite. Yeah, polite is the word I'm looking for. I don't want to offend, but it's always people who are suicidal actually want to be asked. They want somebody to say, oh, how are you doing? And to mean it, not just something that we say like a cliche, but something that we really mean. So asking about suicide does not sow the seed in people's minds. And the other thing is that suicide is not an attention-seeking act. None of us can read somebody else's mind. And so to say that, oh, that person is just a cry for help, it's always, nobody can be that sure. And it's always, in fact, it's anyone who even commits an act of self-harm or attempts suicide is in distress. There is something, nobody whom everything is going well for, who are really where they want to be in the state of their minds, will attempt to take their lives. So it just means that there is something going on. And of course, every suicidal death, the other one is that every suicidal death was due to mental illness. That's also something that is not true. We know that mental illness is a huge risk factor for suicidal death. There's no doubt about that. However, also, a lot of suicidal crises are related to psychosocial stress, financial difficulty, marital breakdown, loss of bereavement, loss of a job, unemployment. All of those things can actually trigger suicidal attempts or suicidal deaths, poverty, all of those things. And so that's why when we think about suicide and its prevention, we need to be we need to be very creative in terms of what we are thinking about, and we need to be very wide in our scope. Right. So let's look at the maths. What does the maths say? What does the statistics say? According to the World Health Organization, they say it's about 727,000 deaths that occur globally across the world every year. That's a lot. That's huge. It equates to about one suicidal death every 40 seconds, and 1 in 100 deaths are due to suicide. So 1% of every death is a suicidal death. And then when we look at the magnitude of the people who attempt to take their lives globally every year, we are looking at 20 million annually. Those are huge figures. Let's think about it. It's easy to look at those figures and just look at them as figures. But let's think about the dads that are involved. Those are people's spouses. Those are people's dads and moms. Those are people's aunties and uncles, sisters and brothers, work colleagues, leaders, directors, work colleagues, subordinates, managers. When we think about it that way, it sort of makes sense. And like I said earlier, that when we look at in most countries of the world, I think in places, except in places like Lesotho, male suicide, the number, when you look at the cohort of people who die by suicide, most of them, the greater percentage of them are males. In the UK, it's 75% of those who die by suicide are males, while 25% are females. In the United States, that's about 3 to 1, 3 to 1 of the suicidal population, people who die by suicide. In the United States, it's 3.5 to 1. In Australia, it's 3.5 to 1. So for every suicidal death, there are 3.5 males and then 1 female. So for every 7 in the United States and in Australia, for every 7 suicidal deaths, for every 7 suicidal deaths in a man, you would have 2 who are women. In Ukraine, it's even more. I think it's 6 to 1. And that's just the way it is across most nations of the world, except in places like Lesotho, where we do know that there's a high rate of female suicide, which are due to environmental factors in those countries. Right. So in terms of thinking about in the UK, we know that annually, according to the figures from 2023 is the latest figures we've got, National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide. It shows that in that year, there were 5,656 deaths to suicide. And that's so on the average, usually it's about less than 6,000 mark. And we are looking at about 11.2 people in a population of 100,000. So per 100,000 population is about. So those are figures that are really concerning. They are huge. And that's about 125 people taking their lives by suicide in the UK on a weekly basis. Those are quite they are profound figures, really, when one thinks about them. And of course, 1 in 5 people say they've had suicidal thoughts in a lifetime. So we've been talking about what we call the gender paradox of suicide, really, that men, there are more males who die by suicide than females. And there's a paradox to that. The reason why there's a paradox to that is this. There's a huge inequality in terms of the gender inequality, in terms of more men dying by suicide than females. But this is the thing. We also do know that suicide is very heavily linked to mental difficulties and mental conditions, and particularly depression. We know, for instance, that for somebody who has a depressive illness, they have up to 20 times more the risk of dying by suicide than somebody who is Joe Blocks on the street who doesn't. So depression is quite a huge risk factor for suicide. However, here is where the paradox is. So a lot more males are dying from suicide than females. However, we know that when we look at the population of people who are depressed, we know that usually the male-female ratio is 2-1, a female-male ratio. So there are double the amount of women who incidence of depression in women is twice that of men. So really, we are thinking depression is a risk factor for suicide. However, more women, at least more women present. There is a school of thought that wonders whether it's that the issue is that men don't present with depression or don't ask for help. Maybe that's why it looks like we have double the number of women being diagnosed with depression than men. However, the question still remains that if there are so many women who are depressed, more than men, why do we have more men dying by suicide? And that's remarkably more. So that's the gender suicide paradox. And there are quite a lot of things that have been said about that. Like I said earlier, that looking at male suicide could give us a bit of an insight as to what really happens with suicide. And that's because a lot more suicides occur in males than females. So what do we know about men's mental health? We know that globally, regarding men's mental health, we know there are certain things that we know. For instance, we know that there are certain conditions that are commoner in men: alcohol misuse, alcohol dependence, substance misuse, illicit drug misuse, all of which are risk factors for suicide. They are commoner in men. But we also do know that men are less likely to recognize the symptoms of mental conditions. And when we recognize the symptoms, we are lot less likely to ask for help. I hope you can see the picture now. So men are less likely to ask for help, and even when men are less likely to recognize the features, and when the features have been recognized, less likely to ask for help. And even sometimes men also are more likely to feel that they are wasting the time of the professional by talking about their emotions and talking about their mental difficulties. So we can see where we can begin to put the puzzle together. And it's also very well known that men, there have been studies that show that men are less likely generally to present with any health condition to general practitioners anyway. There is some study in the UK, and I think it's been replicated in other places. So because of that, we have men who then present late. We have men whom sometimes the first time that people get to know that there is a crisis at all is when they attempt suicide or when they die by suicide. So what are the other things that we do know? We also do, that's the suicidal paradox. But the other thing we also do know is that we know that when it comes, we also do know that men sometimes present with atypical symptoms of depressed mood. Whilst I will, in a few slides, we are going to show what the typical features of depressed mood or depression is. However, men can present with anger outbursts, road rage, reckless risk-taking behavior, indiscriminate gambling, indiscriminate sexual behavior, reckless business ideas, because those are ways. It's almost like it feels like the acceptable ways to express emotional distress, turning to drink and drugs, because that's self-medication, trying to use alcohol and illicit substances, drugs, uh, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, name it, to try to numb the emotional pain. And of course, the other one that is very subtle in society is that sometimes it's about burying oneself into work, hoping that working hard will make it go away. All of those things are features that are, and of course, sadly, it's not uncommon for the first time that people get to know is when there's a suicidal death. And of course, we also do know that when we look at the population of people who attempt suicide, more females there are more female attempters. So people who attempt suicide but then don't succeed. But more males tend to, when you look at that population, it looks like men are usually more successful. I don't want to, success is sort of an aberration and hard word to use. However, men are more likely to complete suicide in that way. And that's because men are more likely to go through, to use more dangerous means in terms of hanging, in terms of firearms, in terms of drowning, and maybe more access to guns as well. So lethal means are usually associated, male suicides are associated with more lethal means. And the other thing we do know is that as the age progresses, particularly after the age of 65, we are also finding out that the age disparity, the gender disparity increases. So if I see an older man, for instance, a man who is over 65, not that I do not trivialize any suicidal intent anyway. However, when you see somebody who is advanced in their years, it's even more reason to worry, particularly if they are males. So just those things to bear in mind as we progress. And the other thing that we also do know is that there's a differential impact of life events. The impact of life events on men appear to be more profound when a man loses a spouse, when they lose their job, when there's any form of loss, because men are more likely to identify being a breadwinner, being able to put bread on the table as a symbol of masculinity. So when that's lost, then that can be a huge problem. I'm aware that some of my psychiatric colleagues are on the call. So this slide is particularly for you. I know we've got a mixed variety in the audience. We've got a variety. We've got a mixed audience. We've got professionals. We've got people from the community. We've got leaders. We've got religious leaders and all of that. So what I've tried to do is to try and cater for the need of everyone. So this slide, for those who are psychiatrists or who work in psychiatric settings or who work in the mental health industry, this will interest you because this is a study. This is drawn from a study by a lady called Susanna Bennett, who has studied male suicide based at the University of Glasgow. Really profound research evidence coming out from the studies. And currently, for those who are interested, if you Google her, she's currently doing a national tour where they actually have safe spaces where they host events talking about male suicide. So if that's something that interests you, you could Google her. She's also on LinkedIn, Susanna Bennett. She's done quite profound, her post-PhD thesis was on male suicide. And this is what she found. She found that 96% of the studies, 96% of the studies that she looked into on male suicide there was a link between male suicide and societal and cultural values. So there's something about society, there's something about the culture, there's something about the beliefs and the attitudes that we hold towards men in certain communities that is actually supporting male suicide rather than preventing it. And what did they find? She also found that in places where there are certain unwritten rules, how men should do emotions, how men should express themselves, our definition of male success, all of those things were found to actually impact on male suicide, and also what jobs were acceptable or unacceptable for males. All of those things, interestingly, they sound very subtle, but they are very deeply ingrained into communities and into society. And what did they find? They found that in communities where it was unacceptable or thoroughly frowned at that men should express emotions, where suppression of emotions was the norm, they were at higher risk. The men in those communities were at higher risk. The other thing that they found was that in places where there was high premium being placed on men's success, and where failure or any adversity of men, particularly when it comes to their economic earning power, was frowned at, there was also a higher risk, because in those places, anything that causes a man to feel trapped, feelings of entrapment, were associated actually with suicidal behavior. Norms that diminish the need for men to interact together, and particularly to have peer-to-peer support. So those are the 3 or 4 main themes that emerged from Susanna Bennett's piece of research. Like I said, she's on LinkedIn and University of Glasgow. She's published quite a number of papers, and currently she's also doing some work with Man Up. Man Up is a charity. They're in the UK, but I think they started from Australia, really supporting men working towards preventing male suicide. So they are doing, like I said, Susanna Bennett and Man Up are co-hosting events around the UK currently, talking about male suicide and the work, how communities can work towards preventing that. So I said earlier that depression, having a clinical depression, increases the risk of suicide by up to 20-fold more, 20 times more at risk. So if we can know what symptoms to look out for, that may suggest or give us an inkling that somebody may be depressed, and we're able to support them that way. If that's all we can do in a community, if that's all somebody can do, I want to be able to at least know when something is off, and maybe just be bold enough to ask that question. That will be better than knowing nothing at all. So what are the common features of depression? We know that low mood is the hallmark, and it's low mood that is persisting for more than a 2-week period. When it reaches the 2-week cutoff, then it's becoming significant. And it's the type of low mood that people say that usually they start of the day feeling, oh God, it's another day. They can't face facing another day. They can't face getting out of bed and thinking about the chore of another day. However, as the day wears on, the mood improves. Come tomorrow, it's a repeat of that. Some people describe life as going through a dark tunnel. Some people describe life as having lost taste. Some people feel that it's almost like life becomes very bland and without flavor and zest. It just feels everything is just bland and down. Low energy is another very key factor for no apparent reason. So it's not that the person has been working hard, they're just flat on energy. And of course, loss of interest and pleasure. Somebody is a Man U or Tottenham fan, or Liverpool fan, they can't just stand even switching on the television to look at what's happening. When that's happening and there's low mood, there's low energy. The other features, disturbed sleep. And the classical feature of depression is early morning awakening. Early morning awakening, which means that somebody's waking up 2 hours earlier than they usually will wake up for no apparent reason, not because they want to wake up to do anything, to pray or to watch maybe to log on to something. They just can't sleep. They can't just wake up too early. For depression, it's early morning waking up at least 2 hours earlier than normal. For anxiety, it's difficulty going to sleep. And for bipolar depression, for bipolar illnesses, is diminished need for sleep. So that's the person doesn't feel there's a need for sleep at all. Right. So appetite as well tends to go, but there's also subtle signs, distorted thinking, hopelessness, worthlessness, helplessness. When people begin to express that, those are red flags. I'm a burden. Really, I really think my family would be better off without me. And then they will be rid of all this pain and all this burden I'm putting on them. When one hears those type of things, whether from a colleague or if a family member, a friend, there are alarm bells that that person might be on the verge of suicide or maybe contemplating suicide already. Anxiety is very common with depression, poor concentration, feelings of guilt. They just feel they are the ones dragging everybody down. And of course, that can also affect the physical part of their intimate relationships. That can be poor libido. And terminally, there could be suicidal death. Right. So what do we know? Who is at risk? Because I remember yesterday I posted something on LinkedIn about suicide, and somebody actually made a very thoughtful comment and said, "What do we need to know? Who are the people? How do we know that somebody is at risk? How do I know my colleague is at risk? How do I know my neighbor is at risk?" We've said already about the male-female disparity, but then it's more than that. It's also the strongest risk factor that is known in terms of suicide risk is previous attempts. So if somebody's attempted suicide before, that's an alarm bell. It's a warning bell. It's something that we must always be aware of. And we also do know that a large percentage, more than 50% of people who die by suicide are under 50s, and that up to 75% of them actually come from low income and middle income countries. But there are also certain groups of people. We've talked about psychosocial stress, poverty, loss of employment, bereavement, work-related stress, work-related bullying, hardship at work, all of those things, anything that causes persistent stress, relationship breakdown, divorce, domestic violence, domestic abuse, all of those things can actually tip people over the edge. One that people are now talking about also is when a man loses custody to his children because of a relationship breakup. The interesting thing, or the remarkable thing about suicide is that as a professional, when you've been involved in somebody's care and they die by suicide, it never leaves you. You remember, it's not something that ever goes away. Somewhere at the back of your mind, the lessons are always there, and the pain as well. And I still remember that out of the handful of suicides that I've been involved in their care, I still remember one of the young men that was what pushed him over the edge. The fact that the relationship broke down, and he was separated. He was then denied access to his daughter. So those are things that we know about in community. They are not things that are strange to us. They are things that we get to know about, and it's important that we begin to be aware of them. And of course, in the UK, for instance, we do know that people who are from the Black ethnic minority communities are at higher risk. People who are living alone, chronic pain and chronic illnesses. For instance, we do know that anyway, that heart attacks, hypertension, diabetes, and chronic physical illnesses, Parkinson's, all of those, most of the major chronic physical health conditions are associated with depression. And we know already that depression increases the risk. So those are things to think about. And of course, refugees, migrants. I know that a lot of people who are on this call tonight are from the Black ethnic minority community, for instance. We know that in the UK, for instance, in the last 2-3 years, there's been an insurge of a lot of people coming from back home in Africa and coming to settle in the UK. That can be risk factors, relocation, being uprooted from where you've had your base and your support and coming to a new country and having to start from the scratch. having to face unemployment, having to put your children in school. All of those things are stressors that can tip people over the edge. We do know also that people who are in prison, the prison population have a higher suicidal risk. Gambling, people in the LGBT community as well at higher risk. And then interestingly, more recently, we are also knowing that death, suffering bereavement by suicide, when somebody has lost somebody to suicide, actually increases their risk 2.5 to 3 times fold. We do know anyway that family history of suicide as well is a risk factor. So, and of course, people who are on the spectrum, who are either autism or who have any neurodevelopmental disorder. Now, the next thing to think about is this. So what works? Because I'm sure you're thinking, oh, this is all sounding very doom and gloom. Where does this end? Is that what's this all about? The good news is that there are things that work. Research does show that there are things that work in suicide prevention, and these are evidence-based. Research has proven that they exist. So to start with, I mentioned earlier that in 2013, the World Health Organization released their 17-year plan with a view that the expectation was that by 2030, suicide rates, there'll be a 1/3 reduction in global suicide rate. And it looks like following that plan by the World Health Organization, there was a remarkable change in reduction in suicide rates. However, that appears to be plateauing at the moment. And that's why there's still more work to be done. And that's why we are doing what we are doing now. That's why Tripartite Care hosts an event the last Thursday of every month. For this month, September, because it's a World Suicide Prevention Day, we've decided to bring the September event forward. And then the next event would then be first week in October. But usually we meet every last Thursday of the month. So going back to the World Health Organization mental health, the plan, the action plan, one of the things that they wanted to do, one of the aspirations is to reduce suicide rate by 1/3, and that's already working. What do we also know? We also do know that restricting access to means of suicide is an effective way. And you might think, oh, how does that affect me? Being with somebody who is suicidal and just clearing their cupboard of tablets, putting it away for a while, taking away the knives and all the sharps might look like a very simple act, but that might be a life-saving act for them. So we do know that restricted, and on a national level, on a global level, there's also research proving that works. Restricting access to means of suicide. In Sri Lanka, when the government in 1995 decided that they were going to phase out and abolish the use of toxic pesticides, there was legislation against that. They stopped using it completely in Sri Lanka. What they found out was that between 1995 and 2005, a 10-year period, there was a 93,000 reduction in the number of, that was over that 10-year period. So on the average, about 9,300 suicidal death reductions every year. That's huge. Not only so in the UK, I'm not old enough to remember that, but they say that in the 60s, that it was toxic gas that was being used for cooking. And then there was a transition to non-toxic, not sea gas. And that marked a reduction in suicidal rate from gas intoxication, asphyxiation during that period. But we also do know that the more recent one that I can identify with is that when there was legislation very early in the noughties to reduce the number of paracetamols that people could buy. You couldn't buy more than 1 box of paracetamol at one purchase in the shops. The paracetamol poisoning, which was the leading cause of suicidal death by poisoning in the UK, fell. And not only so, the number of people who required liver transplant and those who died by paracetamol poisoning was remarkably reduced. So the good news is that these things work. And that things do change by even simple measures like that. And that's why it's important to have a multi-level, multi-sectoral government-driven approach, because I'm aware that there are also people who are listening to me from other countries of the world where legislation is still quite an issue. I know, for instance, that the criminalization of suicide is still something that is being worked on in some of these countries, where suicide is still deemed a criminal offense, which is punishable. Right. So responsible, and the other one that's been known to be effective is that when the media portray or talk about suicide, being responsible in the way they relate that. And there's a reason for that, because I think in the next slide or so, we actually do know that the way that people report suicide can actually cause almost like a copycat suicide, particularly when it's celebrities, and particularly when the nature of the means by which the suicidal death took place has been portrayed. When it's been described. We now know that when there's a celebrity suicide, it can increase the risk in that population, but also that the method that is being used can also can increase the risk of that method being used. That's called the Vaver effect. So, but the good news is that the opposite is also true. That when people who have a platform, who have influence, when they then go when they then use that platform to talk about a story of recovery from the brink of suicide, that also gives people hope, and it makes people to it gives people courage to live on, and all of those things are proven by research. Fostering resilience skills for young people and helping them to develop their resilience skills is also something that is really that is also known to be of benefit in terms of overcoming suicide risk, or rather reducing suicide risk. And what we are doing today in terms of providing information, sharing thoughts, all of those are quite well known to limit risk, combating loneliness. So restricting access, I think I've talked about that a bit in terms of paracetamol restriction, the non-toxic gas in the UK. I've talked about the Sri Lanka example. And then media reporting. Media reporting, there's actually a World Health Organization guidance for media reporting of suicide. It's about not putting it on the center spread. It's about not putting it on the front page. It's about not even naming the method of the suicide. All of those things are actually guidances that have been given to try and not encourage the copycat response that could result. For instance, it's been known that when there's a celebrity suicide, that can be up to a 13% increase, and particularly that for that method, it could be up to 30% increase of that same method. The Papageno effect is the opposite, where when celebrities come out and talk about a story of recovery, that they want the suicidal brink, or people who have, when people share stories, not just celebrities, when people share stories of recovery from suicidal brink, then that's been known to also be of a mitigating effect. There's a particular one that apparently there is a hip hop artist in the United States by the name of, I think it goes by the name Logic. He sang a song a few years ago about his experience with suicide on account of racial bullying, on account of several stressors in his life, became suicidal. And he sang a song about it, but in the song, he actually also sang about the crisis number to call. And interestingly, figures show that there was an increase in the calls, number of calls. Nationally, there was an increase in number of calls to suicide helplines in the United States around that period. And not only so, that there was also about a 6.9 reduction in suicidal deaths over that period. So that's encouraging. It gives hope. It makes us know that these are not just futile exercises, that these things work. And the other thing that has also been found to work is restriction to public sites which are renowned. Just because I'm following my own rules, I wouldn't be naming the popular sites or the known sites in the United Kingdom, in the UK, for instance. But there are certain sites that are known in the UK that are renowned for suicide. When there's a restriction to those sites, and particularly when there are emergency services on ground, on site, that's also been known to be of benefit. So we've talked about user influencer voices here. I think. So I cited the Lancet earlier for my professional colleagues who are on the call. The Lancet, in exactly a year ago, 10th of September 2024, the Lancet released a series of resources, 6 series of articles on public approach towards mental suicide prevention. In my view, for the short time I've been in the field, I think that's been one of the most comprehensive and most thorough piece of work regarding suicide prevention. The reason is because it was a global approach. They had 13 leading suicide researchers across the globe, from the east to the west, from the north to the south, really covering the globe. 13 of them came together and did that large piece of work. It was a year-long piece of work. And what they concluded was that in order for us to be able to realize the reduction of the suicide rate in 2030, that we need a multi-sectoral, we need a multi-level and government-driven approach. And they looked at suicide on 3 levels. They looked at interventions on 3 levels. They talked about the universal intervention, which is just for everybody in society. And they looked at social factors like things like debt relief, that periods of austerity, periods of financial hardship are actually associated with higher risk of suicide in those nations, particularly among men. One of the things that was cited in those series of papers, and those papers are in public domain for it's the Lancet, it's public approach, suicide, it's public approach to suicide prevention. So they found, for instance, that in Brazil, when the government gave quite a significant cash relief during a period of austerity, they found out that there was a 56% reduction in suicide rates among the men who are recipients of those reliefs. I think it's called the Bosler relief. So all of those things, even they've linked things like minimum wage increase, cash transfer to anything that alleviates stress, anything that alleviates financial hardship, anything that supports housing schemes. All of those things ultimately can actually help regarding suicide prevention. And so that's the universal one. It's for society. But they also thought, they looked at suicide prevention or interventions in 3 stratas. There's a universal one just for society. They looked at selective interventions. That's for those who are not suicidal but are at risk. Think about the at-risk group, and that's targeting them with resilient building, education in schools, just anyone who is at demographic risk, helping and supporting them in that way. was what they were looking at. And of course, they then looked at indicated interventions. Those are for the small proportion of people who are actually suicidal. So the point here is that suicide prevention is not just for those who are suicidal. We should be looking at the community review, and we should also be looking at people who are at risk who are not yet suicidal. For those who are in low income and medium income communities and countries, they also looked specifically at what strategies could help in preventing suicide. And from the top, not just exclusive to mental health or health, that suicide prevention should be a global or should be a national, multi-sectoral, multi-level approach where education, police, judiciary, health, social services, housing, all of these people are collaborating, all of these systems are collaborating together to really multi-agency, multi-sectoral approach to prevent suicide, because it's a yeoman's job. It's an unachievable job to leave the responsibility of suicide prevention exclusively to health and mental health. It's like a lost battle, because there are other things that are beyond the control and remit of mental services that drive suicide. There are other drivers of suicide that are beyond the remit and control of mental services. So, in fact, in those papers, for those who are interested in it, for my colleagues who are on the call, I think it's really, they've written six papers in the Lancet, really worth looking at. One of the thinking from that was in terms of, rather than suicide being under the remit of the Minister of Health, that suicide prevention could actually be dedicated to somebody who is a national, who has a ministerial portfolio looking at suicide prevention as their remit, such that it elevates the status of suicide prevention nationally when there's a minister associated with it. And that minister will then be responsible for any national suicide prevention plan for signing that off. They also looked at countries where suicide is still a crime. In those places, it's the police and not health professionals that directly deal with suicide. In terms of, it's reported to the police, and the police are the ones that gather data. And because the police, their role is not to gather physical data, their role is not to gather mental data. They are there to keep the peace. So there needs to be a collaboration in terms of basically what they were saying was that. So even a lot of countries where suicide is still a crime, people don't even know what the suicide rate is, the actual suicide rate, because a lot of the figures go to the police and not to health. And of course, things like restriction of access to toxic means, which we all know. So that's further details of the study. And for those who want like a crash course in what this Lancet study, they also hosted a webinar on the day. And that webinar with the title on the screen is also on YouTube. And that's a YouTube link. It's 1 hour, it's less than 90 minutes, really very. There were about 5 leading global names in suicide prevention research that spoke on the webinar. Really very highly quality content webinar for those who will be interested in that. So that it's been uploaded on the International Association for Suicide Prevention website, IASSP. That's where they were the ones that hosted that webinar a year ago. Right, so as we begin to wrap this up, every suicide is like an orchestra producing an individual symphony. Every human carries its own melody. Basically, what that is saying in short or in summary is this, that there is no single thing that then tips somebody over to suicide. There is usually an interconnection of several factors. And that's why everybody, like in an orchestra, where everybody plays their part. If you don't play your part in an orchestra, it will show. Those who have an ear for music know that this is not sounding right. For some of us whose ears are not trained, we might not pick it up. But for those whose ears are trained, they know that the bass guitarist is really not playing, or their violinist is not really playing to par. They know. And that's the way it is with suicide prevention as well, that when everybody plays their role. So just quickly looking at children and young people, the suicide in children and young people, this is now becoming a global health concern as well, for global public health concern. And the reason being that we are beginning to see more of that among young people. For instance, in the UK, we now know that there has been, between 2023 and 2024, there was a 10% rise in the referrals to mental services for young people. And interestingly, even among young people, 15 to 24s, among just generally teenagers, young people, that male-female ratio of 3:1 is still preserved, which is quite interesting. And then it's the periods of transition. What are the risk factors for young people? Periods of transition, when they are facing academic pressure, when they're about to take their exams, childhood trauma, when they're being bullied. And let's remember that bullying is not just physical bullying now. Cyberbullying is in fact worse, because for physical bullying, when you come home from your bully, you have some respite. For cyberbullying, it's 24/7. They have access to you 24/7, and they can make life very difficult. Relationship breakdown, alcohol and drug use, intergenerational conflict, when they don't seem to see eye to eye with their parents, or their parents don't seem to see eye to eye with them, that can also be huge issues. And then periods of transition, going away to university, starting a new job, moving away from home, having a child, starting work. All of those things can be transitional challenges for young people. So how do we support them? Take disclosure seriously. Any disclosure is a big deal. However, it's important to be calm and to be non-judgmental. It's important to explore, to be there to encourage, to be there to support, and not to be there to... The role, when somebody is in suicidal crisis, they are not looking for somebody who is going to tell them 1,001 things they need to do. They are looking for somebody who's going to listen to them, who is going to support them, who is going to be a listening ear, and probably help them to explore options in terms of what safety options are. It's also important, when one can, to withdraw any means of perpetrating the suicidal acts, tablets, shops, that sort of thing. Support them in reaching out for help. It may be staying with them to call the emergency services. It might be helping them to make a GP appointment. Whatever it is that they need. Sometimes it's just that it's practical help that is really important. Looking after your own mental health is also very important. And don't promise to keep a secret, because sometimes confidentiality needs to be broken. If the life of somebody is at risk and they've said very expressly that they plan to take their life, and they've got plans, and you know that their life is at risk, sometimes the only way forward is to agree with them to break confidentiality. Thankfully, I've not had to do it many times in the community, but the times it's happened, I've been glad that I did. So check what are the other things? What are your personal responsibilities now? Checking in with loved ones. We do know that when there is a sense of community, when people feel loved, and people that they do better, reaching out to people who might be struggling. Maybe they've had a bereavement, maybe they've had a loss, maybe they're struggling with their job. It's always important to do that, and to reach out with empathy, and also to keep ourselves informed. Keeping ourselves informed is one of the other ways to avail ourselves of trainings like these, formal trainings. And for those who have had lived experience, to share their stories. It's always inspirational when people listen to other people who have come back from the brink. And of course, to challenge stigma wherever we find it. So what are the things to look out for? We said some of the features of depression. social withdrawal, indiscriminate use of alcohol. When people start making final acts, starts putting their house in order, starts giving away their pets for no apparent reason, that could be alarm bells. They start arranging for who's going to take over the property when there's no apparent reason for it. When they start talking about being a burden on other people, start talking about they feel that life would be better off without them being in it, or they talk about insurmountable or unsolvable problems, then or irritable mood, all of those things. The Samaritans, that's what they've shared in terms of really how do you support people? I think most of them we've talked about already. And that's the tripart care model of really carrying out that emotional distress conversation. A lot of people worry about being, oh, I'm not a professional, but you're authentic. You genuinely care about other people. Some people are too cautious. It's about not being too cautious. I'm cautious. I don't want to ask them because if I ask them, I might sow seeds. No, we don't sow seeds because research shows that we don't. Confidentiality is a very key one. However, I don't promise to keep secrets if the life of that person might be at risk. Yes, confidentiality, but it's confidentiality within the confines of safety. And let's putting away distractions, the chief among them being this. That's the distraction we need to put away first if we really want to get people's attention. And of course, being open to be available, but also be able to being able to share with ourselves. And every time somebody gives a disclosure, I say thank you to them because I know how huge that could be to them in terms of really sharing what they're going through. So I'm always grateful that they have shared that. And of course, we always then make a plan. When am I going to contact you next? Am I going to contact you? Is it by WhatsApp? Is it by phone call? Is it by email? What works? Let's put together a forward plan, because a suicidal crisis might not be a one-off thing. So how do we continue to support you? This is really about listening, the basic rules of listening. Summarizing back to people what you've had them say, showing empathy, body language that is open and supportive, showing that they've got your full attention. And then for yourself, are you in a good headspace to be able to give that support? Are you willing at that point to be able to listen? Are you prepared for them to open up to you? Because I hear often people say, oh yeah, opening up to somebody was the worst thing I ever did because they just threw it back in my face. But they weren't prepared because sometimes we don't know what to do with disclosure. We just don't know what to do with it. But hopefully from tonight, with some of the things that we are sharing, also it's also about being able to maintain to find a private place where to have that conversation and to have it at a good time. Right. So this is a crux of what we've been saying all along. That really, this is the UK 5-year suicide prevention plan, and it's really about. It's got to be multi-sectoral. It's got to be government-driven, and it's different organizations coming together, pulling resources together to prevent suicide. What can people do in workplaces and all of that? It's got to be driven from the board level. Stamping out toxic work cultures. Between a third and half of people who have mental difficulties, particularly depression, say that there's a strong association with workplace difficulties and workplace stress. So supporting people who have newly joined the organization. What can faith organizations, what can churches or even other faith organizations do? Celebrating global awareness days, mental awareness days, suicide prevention day, that can be an opportunity to reach out. For instance, in about 4 weeks' time, I'm going to have an opportunity to speak in my church about mental health, and that's something that we've been doing over the years, and we're going to do it again. Engaging board and leadership is a very key part, really very important. If it doesn't happen from the top, it doesn't happen. And that entails then not only involving the board, but having a strategy, a mental strategy, where everybody knows exactly how to get help and how to get support. Training all the volunteers. Thankfully, that's something that Tripartite Care does. We're able to deliver training that is relevant, that is culturally relevant, that is spiritually in tune as well. And of course, importantly, for leaders to be transparent and authentic. Because if people feel that they are led by people who are real, they are more likely to be real. If people are led by people who are plastic and who don't show any vulnerability, then they think vulnerability is a taboo in that organization or in that church or in that faith culture. And confidentiality is a key thing. Like I said, confidentiality within confines. Even when confidentiality is broken, it should be on a needs-to-know basis. Not that it should still be on a needs-to-know basis. So those are the resources. Some of them I've spoken about already. So people can take photos of that. Really, it's about things that different resources. Samaritans is a place that in the UK, it's a helpline that people can call when in distress. There's something missing there. I think it's Shout. Shout is an organization that supports people with suicidal distress as well. It's a text, it's like a text type of service. Then there's also supportaftersuicide.org, which is really about people who have been bereaved by suicide. Men Shared. We do know that men are more likely to talk and express emotions and talk about distress when there's an activity taking place rather than just sitting down and having coffee, unlike women who are more likely to do that. So what do we have on the horizon for Tripartite Care? On the 2nd of October, we're going to be honing in and really spotlighting young people and youngsters' mental health. As we know, from next week, young people are going to be going back to university. Some of them have gone back already, and freshers are beginning to go and will begin to go from next week. Some of them will begin to go. So 2nd of October is when we are going to do that. And Future for the Future, that's what we are looking at. Those are the other things that Tripartite does. And that's the WhatsApp support group. So for people who are interested in joining the WhatsApp support group, if you just take a photo of that, then it will bring you onto it will take you onto the group, and then we can accept you onto the group. And that's, like I said, for church leaders, for leaders in different spheres of life. We have a different conversation on that group. It's really about being able to support yourself to be well enough to support other people and what your responsibilities are in terms of mental health of people who are under your organization. And we have a book club. We meet every third Thursday of the month, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. And we're currently looking at The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, really classic book on trauma. That's what we are looking at the moment. And that's our Instagram page. So you could click on that. You can follow us on Instagram. And those are my contact details. We've got our YouTube channel. That's the Tripartite Care email address. And LinkedIn is where I hang out the most these days, and Instagram. I still have a Facebook account, but very rarely do I use that now. And thank you all for listening. I know that was quite a long one, but I hope it's been worth your while in some way. And I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to take any questions, comments, feedback.